Well, Fred, here we are once again with Axiom 10 and 11 today.
All right, looking forward to it.
Yeah, so am I. You want to go ahead and start us off with reading Axiom 10?
Yeah, Axiom 10 is very short. That's why we decided to go ahead and take the step into 11. 10 says, in God, relation and divine essence are the same in reality. One and the same divine essence is identical to paternity, filiation, and procession through passive spiration. So one and the same in reality. In the last few axioms, and in the next one we're going to look at, we're dealing with kinds of distinctions. And Polanus has invested in this real distinction, which there is between Father and Son and Spirit. They are not each other. But which there is not between the divine essence and, how does he say it here? The relation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Relation is the principle. Relation is where the principle of individuation is in talking about the Trinity. I don't know why that makes me feel safer to say, as Polanus does, not just that it is the principle of individuation, but Polanus, last time we saw, he said, it's the place, it's the locus where the principle of individuation is. I don't know why I feel safer saying there are places in God.
Yeah. Well, I've really been favoring like spatial metaphors, and maybe that's peeling over even a little bit in my translation. I'm trying to think if place in Latin is literally locus.
Yeah, I mean, it is there.
What it is?
Yeah, he seems to introduce it. Possibly the reason I feel safe saying it is I'm not going to accidentally fall into the error of thinking there are literally places inside of God.
Right.
And so
it's been clearly sanitized enough as an idea. Yeah. And you've commented this really helpfully, Fred, both the possibility for using metaphors or verbal figures of speech to get around things, because it seems like we're always talking sideways. At least that's how I always feel. I'm always talking sideways when I'm talking about God. So both the strengths and the weaknesses for that. Do you see that as kind of a fundamental like tool that we should be deploying in our talk about God, or what are your thoughts on those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think that's right. And maybe, I don't know if this is a kind of a learned ignorance, but it's to use ways of talking that you can't accidentally take in earnest as being actual claims. I mean, I think the Bible trains us in this when it uses definite anthropomorphisms about God's, nose and fingers and toes. I don't think that, the people of the Old Testament are so primitive they took that literally. I actually think God, as a good teacher, is saying, well, I know no one's going to think I've got a nose.
Right.
So now I will say things about the blast of my nostrils.
Interesting. I haven't thought about it that way before. I know I'm sensitive to technical terms often become inflated, and we treat them as more than they are. We like to launch into our technical terms, and it actually becomes this really weird way of doing Trinity. Whereas, like you say, if you're favoring, yes, precision, right? We're not talking about abandoning precision, but a way of doing it that prevents you from stopping here and looking at the metaphor rather than using the metaphor to look at God. That's really good advice.
Yeah. So I think the main point I get from Axiom 10, a lot of these axioms are, Polanus has already established something, but he puts it another way, not to pick a fight, but almost to, and not to overcomplicate things, but almost to say, but if you think about it this way, here's an error you could make. So I'll say it this way and point out that you shouldn't make this error. And there's something like this. I mean, I could say about the doctrine of the Trinity, there are two things in God that you got to get straight. There's the essence and there's relation. And, at one level, that's accurate, depending on what I mean by what I just said there. I could sign yes on that statement. But then you come down to it and say, well, I said there are two things, but really, according to this axiom, relation and divine essence are the same in reality. I think that's the kind of the edge he's trying to push here, so you don't
Yeah.
you don't think that there I've got this distinction, because when it comes down to it, as we've said before, the well, what's he say here? The divine essence is identical to paternity.
Yeah. One thing I think he helpfully points out here, so we've talked about how the formality or the proper concept of a relation, its towardness, is preserved when we deploy it, when we predicate it of God, which is how we get this real distinction to work. But one of the unique things that the scholastics realized, and even much before the scholastics, but one thing they realized about relation is that the proper concept of a relation is wholly separable from its accidentality. So the accident part of a relation, you can sever off, and the proper concept is left wholly intact. That's actually the unique distinction of relation in contrast to all other accidents, quality, quantity, etc. And that's how we use it in the doctrine of God. One thing I've noticed some people forget is that you take off the proper concept and then you can predicate this towardness, this facingness of God truly. But in order for that to be real, that you have to have the relation be filled with some type of existence. And the great thing about this, and again, why relations are useful for Trinitarian discourse, is that it doesn't matter if the relation has real existence, like real creaturely existence, or rational existence in my head, or is the totality of the divine existence. You can fill it with any one of those types of existences, speaking loosely, and it doesn't flex the proper concept. So when we get to God, we take this formality, just like we say God's goodness is God himself, is the essence itself. We fill up the formal concept we have of goodness with the fullness of divine life. So this proper concept of relation, we backfill with the entirety of divine life, even though we can't know that fullness of divine life because of our limits as creatures. This is just how relations work. Relations are existentially neutral, and we can do anything we want in doing that. So I think that's one area that he's doing here, is that when relation has to be in God and has to partake of the divine essence, but really it is the entirety of the divine essence because it takes on that full life.
Yeah. Again, I in all of these axioms so far, I miss some of Augustine's way of talking. I wish. So if I were teaching this, I like what Polanus does here, but it's helpful for me to say, "Oh, this is what I learned in Augustine." Oh, I don't know how to pronounce that. Augustine. I'll say Augustine. American.
I say Augustine.
Yeah. August. I sometimes trip up and say Augustine. In Augustine, he would say, we're talking about God, and there are two ways of talking about God. Either you can talk essentially or relationally about God. And so to say we're not talking about the essence and relations as if they're things side by side, but to say we're talking about God the entire time, essentially or relationally. So there's not a difference between the essence and the relation.
Right.
Yeah, there's not a real distinction. Yeah.
Right, as to the existence. They're not different existences.
Right. Good. Okay, well, that's probably enough on Axiom 10. Axiom 11 is, it's unusual. It's an unusual one. 15 is also a really strange one, I think, just because it's so long, and I don't know what topic sentence to give it. But 11 has a short kind of a restatement and approaching this same truth from another angle. And then Polanus just says, Gabriel Biel, and drops in a long quote from Gabriel Biel's sentence commentary.
And I have to say, boy, I had fun trying to translate this. Yeah. It was the last thing I translated. I was just pulling out my hair.
Yeah, if I were grading this, I would get out my red pen and write quote integration at the top and the bottom. Like you can't just say, here's a quote, and then do cut, paste, giant quote. You have to set it up, tell the reader why you're quoting this. Then when you're done, tell them what we learned from what you quoted.
Mm.
So students, don't do this. Don't try this at home. Polanus just drops this giant Biel quote in here, and in itself, it's fascinating. I can see why he's attracted to it. It's got a lot of interesting terms.
Yeah.
But let me just say before we jump into that, Gabriel Biel is a late medieval nominalist.
Yeah.
Is there a school we can identify him with? I can't remember. You never run into Gabriel Biel, B-I-E-L, except in discussions of his influence on Luther, because Heiko Obermann did a great piece of scholarship about the Reformation, where the Biel-Luther influence is, subject to discussion.
Yeah, he was very influential on the Brethren of the Common Life, and that
Okay.
I think is primarily. I'm not either a Biel or a Luther expert, but I think that's where that's coming from.
Yeah, so it's interesting to get a late medieval figure who is, in our century,
A fairly
famous for his-
minor figure as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Obermann's big thing is that Biel really worked with the sentence, do what is in you, to talk about justification. If you do what is in you, God will meet you, etc. And so he kind of played that out across Luther's Reformation theology. It's just weird to be way down here in the Protestant scholastic period and have a chunk of Biel show up.
Yeah, I don't see, and again, I'm not an expert in the Protestant Reformed scholastic period of the High Orthodoxy or whatever, but I don't see a lot of Biel. He's not, maybe your big three or four. You got Thomas, you got Scotus, you got Occam, Henry, Bonaventure, Albert, Alexander, Capriolus, all these sorts of guys, and then Suarez, of course. But Biel is 15th century. I think it's 1420 or so to 1495. Just it's very, very strange to find this here.
Yeah. All right. So the axiom itself is the relations of the persons differ really between themselves, and they differ merely formally from the essence, but not really from the essence.
Right.
So in Axiom 10, he just said there's not a real distinction between relation and essence in God. And here he says, he basically comes back and says, but there is between person and relation of person and themselves.
Right. So relation that's opposed and real, like we saw in the last 7, 8, 9, and another relation that's opposed and real, that's a real distinction.
Yeah.
But relation with the underlying essence, it's not real, so we resolve it by a divine simplicity, even though the ideas are different. That's what he thinks, and that's what he means by they're formally distinct. So a relation, the idea of a relation, the proper concept is formally distinct from the divine essence. And then, of course, you have to resolve that the fact that we have two separate intellectual acts, right, that grasp essence and relation, we have to resolve that. Can't allow that to indicate a real distinction in God based upon our different ideas.
Good. Okay, so then we have it's like a 290-word quote from Biel, which is pretty meaty. I don't want to read the whole thing. The opening gambit, though, is, in God there exists nothing really beyond the essence, the relation, and the person constituted out of the essence and relation. That's an interesting kind of mathematical idiom to put it, right? You've got essence and relation, and essence plus relation equals person.
Yep.
That's tidy.
Yeah, very tidy. I find that the next statement I don't see talked about a lot in Protestant Trinitarian theology, but then he even goes on and he talks about, so okay, we have three real relations which are constitute the persons, Father, Son, Spirit. But recall, in a Trinity, we have four real relations, actually. So we have Father, constituted by paternity, filiation, the Son, Holy Spirit, and passive spiration. But there's also the real opposed relation of active spiration, which with the essence is constituted also as a real, which is really distinct from passive spiration. And he talks about this here, which...
And what you just rehearsed is the that's the basis for the old mnemonic device that you get told about from Catholic scholastic theology. Is it 5 notions, 4 relations, 3 persons, 2 processions, 1 God? The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
people who,
I always go it the other way. Interesting. That's
oh
a
yeah,
better way though. Yeah.
yeah. The way I was taught it was by people who were sick of scholastic Catholic theology. So, people downstream from Rahner who look back at the manualist tradition and talk about it only pejoratively.
Yeah.
And so you'd usually hear it: 5 notions, 4 relations, 3 persons, 2 processions, 1 God, and 0 understanding. And,
oh, that hurts my heart, though.
Yeah,
oh,
it is.
God.
It's also the kind of put down that, like, it's devastating. It kind of fits, or people wouldn't say it. But also, the more you hear it, the more you think, I'd kind of like to read some of those manuals and scholastics and see, how that was all put together and why that was considered worth doing for so long.
Yeah, I find that the 4 real relations, the fact that there's 4 with only 3 persons is confusing to people quite a lot. But yeah,
because if you're just thinking in God everything is one except where there is opposition of relation, if you just apply that, you would expect 4 relations to underwrite 4 persons.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason why they don't is because paternity and active spiration are not opposed. Mm-hmm. So they don't make 2 separate persons. There's just one Father. And same for filiation and active spiration in the Son. Likewise, they're not opposed. So they don't split a Son. So we can't actually get 4 persons because of our rule. Only real opposed relations distinguished, and those 2 in each of the Father and the Son are not opposed.
Yeah. So
that's a helpful thing to remember.
It is. I don't want to get off on a tangent here. Maybe we can come back to this later. I just think about the Son-Spirit relation and what sort of things you can't helpfully say about the relation of the Son and Spirit.
It's really Yep, go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
You're coming out of the Bible, so you're not just freestyling here. You're trying to interpret Scripture, and then the forms that are sort of proposed to us for interpreting some of these issues are the ones we've just been rehearsing.
Yeah.
And but you could come out of any relation you observe between Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit in the economy of salvation and attempt to describe it as an immanent Trinitarian thing. But this is where you'd really start to feel the burn of like, whoa, wait a minute, I'm going to multiply persons accidentally. If I treat these, it's a downstream error that you want to see coming. Like, if I do that though, I'm going to end up dividing by 0 down there, and I already know from the beginning that I should not end up with 4 persons, or I've done my math wrong.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. So I was recently reading Thomas again for a class I was teaching on Trinity, and so the fact that the Father and Son both have this one real relation of active spiration of the Spirit seems to really poke at the Eastern Orthodox Church's concerns about demoting the Father's monarchy and having him, ignoring taxes. And some interesting things that Thomas says is that, there are 2 who are really distinct, and that taxis is preserved, which is why we can say truly the Father through the Son breathes the Spirit, but not the Son through the Father. That's a false statement. Yeah. But even though there's 2, in the very principling, they're one, and in the very having of the relation, there's one. So at the active spiration, there's no taxis that we insert into the active spiration, even though there are 2 who are, distinct according to taxis who are doing that. And I just found that a really helpful way to try to, on the one hand, deal with the Eastern Orthodox concern to really preserve the monarchy of the Father, but also, some of the concerns that you might have with your Latin West.
Yeah, and I'm just a little hypothesis to throw out here. It does seem to me that some of these Protestant scholastic figures, Polanus and von Maastricht is someone I've looked at on this, while they're filioquists, they really are, they're less, I don't want to say they're less dogmatic about it than the Catholic tradition had been, but they are more alert to the legitimate concerns of the Eastern Church in the way they put things.
Yeah. part of that too is historically there was a fairly long time period where there was the possibility of joining back up with the Eastern Orthodox Church, and that idea crashed and burned. But
Yeah.
but that could also be underlying. I don't know if that was really going on during Polanus's time. But
if you make a club of people who think that the Pope has gone too far in exerting his authority, you are going to have Protestants and Eastern Orthodox.
We're all going to be friends.
Both showing up and saying, we actually agree about that. Now, what else we agree about is
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. What do you want to pick out of the rest of this Biel quote?
I just maybe a few other phrases here. I think, so maybe halfway down here, he says, likewise, the relations are distinguished formally from the things constituted by them. So relations are formally distinguished from the person whose relation it is. Paternity is formally distinguished from the person of the Father. I think that's really helpful to remember. The meaning, oftentimes when people, at least it appears to me, when they start talking about the persons who are just relations, they seem to think that means the meaning of personhood is collapsed into relation. And it just
relation without relata.
I'll have to remember how to put it that way. Yeah, that's the right way. Yeah, and so no, the meaning is different, right? A person is an individual, and in this case, the relation is what is constant. That's the principle of individuation, the place, as you helpfully put it. But it's an individual who's possessed of an intellectual nature, which of course God is to a superlative degree. And so the fact that I'm a person, Angel is a person, God by analogy is a person, even though there's different ways of formally constituting our variant individualities. So for me, right, we have to be embodied in order for us to be individuated, at least on the scholastic atonement scheme. So depending on how we quote individualize, that's going to be different. But again, the idea is different from that of a person. So we have to be careful. If we want to constitute by relations, we don't think of the persons just as relations. Like you've said this, the temptation to just worship number. There's also a temptation just to worship relations. And that's really weird. We don't want to do that. So
it's weird. It seems so abstract that maybe only logicians could do it by accident, but you do get, even in popular piety, this is out beyond the responsible people who write about this. You get people who just are mystically attracted to the dynamism of relationality and interchange. And so just sort of, a grand cosmic surging, flowing something where they'll directly tell you, well, Richard Rohr will directly tell you, this is not about the person of the Father and the person of the Son and the person of the Spirit. It's about the flow in which they live. And I think he'll even go so far as to say, and it's bigger than them. or they're not even there. It's just it's relatiness in between them.
Anyway, what else do you think here is good to pick out? What sticks out to you?
Well, so this is all one long quote, except for the one little bit where where, as far as I can tell, though I haven't compared this to the primary text, Polanus goes in and line item vetoes one word. Biel says, thus it is for the disparate relations. And Polanus says, more correctly, they ought to be called diverse, not disparate. That just caught my eye textually as a thing he happened to be doing in the middle of this. In the Latin text, the Biel quote is all in italics, and then this is inserted, not in italics. Yeah. Why is it better to call the relations diverse than disparate? Do you have any intuition on that?
I really don't. It seems some pedantry to me. Okay. But again, I'm not a native Latin speaker during this time period, so apparently there's some overtone about disparate that Polanus really does not like. So
there's something
they don't like the word different a lot, right? So diverse is supposedly weaker than different. For us today, I think, I don't know, is diverse really different from different? I think they're about the same weight or measure out of. Anyway.
Yeah, the noun diversity has greater conjuring power than difference. It would be hard to get people excited about difference. except like, post-structuralists or something got really excited
Sure.
about difference. But diversity
Yeah, that's true.
has a web of connotations that people have a lot of positive associations with.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas for why he would do this?
No, I mean, I couldn't imagine enforcing this. Sometimes I'll correct people if I can tell they're, trying for clarity, and they'll say, Father, Son, and Spirit are different from each other.
Mm.
And then they'll start talking about like, well, I don't mean that I have never met or anything like that. And they'll say, maybe the word you want is distinct.
Mm-hmm.
And generally in English, distinct is a little more careful than different.
Mm-hmm.
Because all you're really trying to say is that they're not each other and they can tell each other apart. Yeah, but I don't really have a reading on this. Yeah. Sorry I pointed it out.
No, I think it's a very funny line.
So the last little bit in this Biel quote is what you've called solving by simplicity or resolving into simplicity. He talks about, relation and person and essence. And then he says, beyond the things just noted, there is no distinction in God. And then he'll rehearse some sort of talking points about the classical Christian doctrine of simplicity here.
Mm-hmm.
Except for the things I just talked about, there's no distinction in God. For this reason, the rest of the things named by other terms are the same in all ways. And they all are not distinguished really from the nature of the thing, formally, or by reason. Then he gives a little list of, I suppose, divine attributes: goodness, wisdom, power, intellect, will, knowledge, love. Yeah, well, what do you think about that? There are lots of ways to state Christian commitment to divine simplicity.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with this. I don't think this is well reflective. Again, I'm not an expert on Biel, but I don't think he's speaking correctly or speaking well. So there's no distinction in God. Of course, we can say, but usually we add the qualifier, there's no real distinction, because there are rational distinctions. And those rational distinctions, we say they're in God for various reasons. The place where Thomas talks about this most clearly is in the first book of the Sentences, Distinction 2, Question 1, Article 3, which is a very helpful, one of the most complex areas of Thomas's sentence commentary. It's very important when we talk about something being in God. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. So Biel here is evidencing an unwillingness to say there are even rational distinctions in God. And he seems to mean that if you just consider God on his own, there's no rational distinction in him, because essentially you don't have a reasoner outside of God. But again, it's not correct. We wouldn't say that. We wouldn't want to say that. We say there are rational distinctions in God, and what we mean by that, roughly speaking, is that the way the mind is splitting things up, it is doing that truly. There is a correspondence that's pinging into God, and so it's justified or it's verified by who God is. And usually, especially neo-scholastics, so people after Biel, people during Polanus's time, are going to be saying, properly speaking, the rational distinctions we use, if you're Thomist especially, are going to be the rational distinction of the reasoned, the passive D, rather than reasoning. And what that means, roughly speaking, is that the way the object you're knowing is, so God in this case, is somehow forcing or causing you to make these distinctions. And we would say because of God's super eminent perfection and the smallness of our minds and these sorts of things. Whereas the reasoning, it has nothing at all to do about the object you're knowing. But yeah, I don't think this is correct.
Yeah. So when I just rehearse that for a minute, if I talk about the difference between God's wisdom and power,
right?
I may really separate those and put, I may make a table, a chart where I make a distinction and say, here's the stuff about God's wisdom, here's the stuff about God's power. Now, in God, the difference between God's wisdom and power is, Biel would want to say, there is no difference. But as you say, that's as if he's leaving the human reasoner totally out of it, in which case, why talk at all?
Right. So they're going to be really the same in God. I would personally agree with Biel there, and everyone would, I assume. There's not going to be, God's goodness over here and his wisdom over here as we think about it in God. But nonetheless, you have to preserve, as you say, the ability to speak, and to speak truthfully and meaningfully as well. And oftentimes in discussions, maybe you've seen this about the divine simplicity, especially among the classical theist guys, they're trying to get the truthful bit, but they're really emptying out the meaningful bit. So all the attributes become totally emptied of conceptual content. And that's not at all how certainly someone like a Thomas is treating the divine simplicity. Works very hard to prevent that. So you have to allow and articulate the set of concepts and descriptions that, as you say, laying out on the table, God's goodness over here and God's wisdom over here as we perceive them, and the distinctions that obtain. You have to allow those things to be true and meaningful, and that's why we would say the rational distinctions that we're making in each one of those sets are in God. And what that means is, our ideas have a correspondence in God. The technical term is, the rationes attributorum, the concepts of the attributes are likewise in God. And that's extreme. So not only are the attributes in God, but our concepts of the attributes are in God. And those are not the same. So you have to,
and you're still preserving the concern of divine simplicity. You're not, if God's goodness and wisdom, or if God's wisdom and power were really different things, there'd be several problems there, but one would be God, then whatever God is, outside of those things that are in him, would be sort of participating in them alternately or to greater or lesser extents. And that would pretty clearly be God composed or under something higher.
Right. That imagery of under something higher, I think, is precisely the way to articulate what we're trying to prevent metaphysically. We don't want to think of something out beyond God, even deeper than God, right? We get to God and we stand outside him, as it were, and all of our ideas terminate in him truly as the source of all that is. And there's nothing further back behind God that's required. He contains it all.
Yeah. It really makes you wish Polanus had said a little more about why he dumped this Biel quote here, because the natural assumption is he agrees with every bit of it except that one word that he wanted to soften or tweak a little bit.
Yeah.
So at least you can say here in this Axiom 11, it's a strong commitment to a pretty direct application of his concept of divine simplicity. I would say, just by way of introduction to some of these distinctions we've made, you can actually look up the word distinction in Muller's Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms. So distinctio, and then he's got, I think, 4 or 5 here. Real, modal, formal, and rational. And he goes through them all. It's a good introductory, about a page.
Nice.
And he also does distinctio rationis rationans.
Yeah, that's
distinction by reasoning.
Yeah, and then the rational distinction is split into 2 parts: of reasoning and of reasoned. The D at the end.
Interesting. Muller's book doesn't. It's a good intro. He's summarizing, a ton of information about how these terms are used, and it'll generally set you up to read some of these texts. It would have to be a much larger book to kind of take you through classic places where these were sort of hammered out. And often it's going to be in something like Thomas's sentence commentary, or even Thomas's sentence commentary as discussed by Thomas interpreters.
Yeah, and there are these sorts of handbooks for those who can read Latin. There are these massive, essentially, dictionaries. One of the most famous is Altensteig's lexicon. And just sitting down and reading that is a phenomenal thing. He has, folio pages on each one of these things, and it's really, really helpful. It's also contemporary for the time period of the Reformed Orthodox, so it's a very standard
Nice.
place that you go. I've spent many evenings reading through Alton Stagg. That tells you how nerdy I am, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's great. It's great work. Yeah.
All right. Well, that is, I think, Axioms 10 and 11.
That's great.
11 really does kind of just come to a close with a kind of a thump, because he's done with that quote and he's ready to move on to the next axiom.
For sure.
All right, which I guess we'll do next time we get together.
Yep. Sounds good. Thank you, Fred. Always a pleasure.
All right. Good to see you around.